Hello and welcome back to my brew garage. Today we are going to be brewing up what I like to call a Centennial Trail IPA. Centennial Trail is a trail that runs through the area here. It's a beautiful trail, especially this time of year in the fall, to just go ride a bike or go for a walk. And what better name for this beer since we're going to be brewing with Centennial and Cascade hops today. Two of my all-time favorites. They just give off a great little bit of piney, sometimes a citrusy, grapefruity note, but just can't go wrong with those hops. We're also going to be adding a little bit of rye today. Just noticed in a beer I tried recently that rye was just a nice little hint of spice that just was pleasant on the palate. The other thing for today, we're using an entirely new brew system. Excited to give this a shot and show you guys my experience with it today. I think that's about all I have to say about today's brew. Let's just get going. Here's what we've got cooking. Today we are using 12 pounds of Maris Otter, 2 pounds of Rye Malt, and a few handfuls of rice hulls. These rice hulls will help make everything flow a little better after the mash and make sure that we don't get a stuck mash. For the hops, we will be using Cascade and Centennial. Quite the hop schedule, as you can see. We will be adjusting our water chemistry today with a West Coast IPA profile. This is a 3:1 sulfate to chloride ratio in my case. For today's brew, we're using an electric all-grain brew-in-a-bag system. For any of these items, feel free to look in the description below. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know at this point I'm typically milling grains. But because today we're using this system on a 120 volt circuit until I get my 240 volt circuit set up, we are going to go ahead and start by heating the water up to 161 degrees Fahrenheit on 100% power. Now this will take a while because it's on 120 volt, but that's okay. I also have a timer set up. So we can find out together how long it takes to get from, looks like it's at 76 degrees right now, all the way up to that 161 degrees Fahrenheit. With our water heating up, we're gonna go ahead and add our mash salts. This is gonna be a profile that makes our beer very hoppy and a little more bitter, just the way I like it. Go ahead and just add that on in. Don't forget to, of course, give that a little bit of a stir. And we'll throw our lid back on. Oh, and I should add our mash temp that we're aiming for is 152 degrees Fahrenheit. That is why we are heating up our water to 161 degrees Fahrenheit. We have to make up for the fact that the grains are at room temperature, and it's going to go ahead and suck some of that temperature out of the water once it gets dumped in. So we're going to go ahead and let this heat up, and I'll see you when it's all ready. While we wait for our strike water to heat up to temperature, we're going to go ahead and mill our grains. Look at those lovely grains. Now, because we are using a percentage of rye in this, which does not have a husk, we're going to go ahead and add a few handfuls of rice hulls. We're going to go ahead and mix that into the grains. This is going to help with just making sure that we don't get a stuck sparge, but it will also help with our efficiency. I know that some people will say that you need to rinse these and or soak them. That is not a wrong answer. You absolutely can do that. It will help prevent a certain amount of your wort being absorbed. Rice hulls do absorb a lot of water. Today, I am just gonna opt to mix it in, put it into the mash tun, and we'll see how it goes. My friends, we have reached our strike temperature of 161 degrees. I stopped this a little bit late, but it took us just a little bit over an hour in order to get that all up to temp. That was from 76 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way. From here, we're gonna go ahead and pour in our grains. Grain basket is already in there, ready to go. We're We're gonna pour in just a little bit at a time, mix it in, make sure we have no dough balls, and then we'll let it sit for 60 minutes. After 10 minutes, we'll come back and take a pH reading. Something to note, I hooked up my recirculation kit. This is my own personal recirculation kit, but you can get one from Anvil. And I have recirculated some of the wort back on top of the grains because we didn't have enough water initially to make sure that we can mash all the grains in. That's because we're going to be using some of this water in the sparge. So just something to note, you don't want to put this pump on full blast, otherwise it will overfill that malt pipe. I have actually cut off the pump for now, so just let it kind of soak and drain back out into the kettle. If it gets a little bit lower, I'll turn it back on, but otherwise, just something to keep in mind. Before I forget, another thing to note is while the mash is going on, I have the temperature set to 152 instead of that previous 161, and I've set the power to 50%. That way it's not kicking on all the time and runs for a good period of time before it shuts back off. 10 minutes in, I've pulled a sample from our mash in order to take a pH reading. I've cooled this down a little bit and stuck in my pH meter. It looks like we're sitting at 5.9. We need to be between 5.2 and 5.4. That's for our best efficiency out of this mash. So at this point, I'm going to add some lactic acid, recirculate a little bit. We'll take another pH reading. We're roughly another 10 minutes into the mash. I've taken another pH reading. After adding roughly 5 milliliters of lactic acid, we're sitting at 5.5 now for pH. We're getting close. I'm going to add probably another 3 milliliters of lactic acid, and then we'll call that good. With our mash finishing up, we're going to go ahead and add our sparge salts to this sparge water that's already been heated to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. I'll come back with a spoon, stir it in, and then we'll wait for the mash to finish and continue from there. Our 60-minute mash has come to an end. I've cranked the temperature up to 170 degrees and 100% power so that we can mash out. This will allow for the liquids to drain more easily into the kettle. Now that mash out has finished, I've pulled the grains, and as it drains, we're gonna go ahead and pour our sparge water over the top. This will help get any of those trapped sugars that are in this mash to hopefully wash out into the kettle. While this happens, we'll go ahead and crank our temperature on here up to boil. And we will set our power to 100%. Now, a key component, by the way, while this drains, is to make sure that you don't disturb this lower portion of the mash. Otherwise, you may have some issues with draining into the kettle. Once this is done draining, we'll go ahead and put this aside into our bucket. We'll go ahead and take a sample and just see what our original gravity is at. See if we hit our target or not. While we wait for our mash to drain into our kettle, get ready to go to a boil, I think now's a good time to get ourselves a brew. Today's brew is from the last video. It's a Bitter River Dip IPA. And this one is it's a funny one. I really like it. Obviously got a ton of head on there, looks beautiful. But it has slight hints of bubblegum. Never have had that in a beer. Something about that Simcoe, Citra, and Mosaic combination this year is given just kind of an interesting flavor. Anyway, feel free to check out the last video right here if you'd like to see how this one was brewed. As we approach our boil, I'm gonna go ahead and add a few drops of firm cap just so that we can make sure that we don't have any sort of a boil over. Really only need a few drops of this. And we'll just put the lid back on and wait for it to get to a boil. Now, key thing with this sort of a setup, make sure you don't leave this unattended with the lid on. you want to make sure you're nearby just in case it overflows. We've reached the beginning of our boil. It is very important again to note that you want to make sure the lid is off when you get to a boil, because this sort of system, it can very easily boil over. Of course, I put some firm cap in there to help with boiling over. I do recommend that if you have it on hand. Otherwise, just be sure to watch it very, very closely and be ready to turn it off if you need to. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and start our 60-minute timer. I have 1 ounce of Centennial. This is our 60-minute hop edition. Go ahead and pour that in. Time for our 45-minute edition, 1 ounce of Centennial. Here's our 30-minute hop edition, ½ ounce of Cascade. Time for our 15-minute edition, ½ ounce of Cascade. We'll also toss in a Whirlflock tablet to help clarify the beer. After adding my 15-minute hop addition, I've started recirculating some hot wort through the lines and the chiller. That way we can sanitize everything. I'm just running it into the hop spider just to help with some utilization of those hops. We've reached the end of our 60-minute boil. It is time to cool this down to 170 degrees Fahrenheit so that way we can pitch in our last hop addition. Right now we're rerouting some of that hot water back there to the fermenter. I've got Star San in there and everything else that we're going to need sanitized sitting in there so it can get nice and clean. We'll be right back. We've reached our 170 degree temp target. Time to add our final hop addition, other than dry hopping, of course. We've got 1 ounce of Centennial and 1 ounce of Cascade. Go ahead and pour those on in. And we've got a little surprise here. 1 ounce of homegrown Cascade hops. Now, you don't need this if you're going to be, of course, making this on your own, but I figured I had them on hand, so why not? From there, we'll set the timer for 20 minutes, keep it at 170 degrees, which, by the way, I set this to 50% power, so that way it can just gently keep it at that 170 degrees. And then from there, we'll cool it down to pitching temp for yeast and put it in our fermenter. We made it to the end of our brew day. Now it's time to add our yeast. I've opted to select Imperial A07. It's their flagship yeast. It's supposed to be nice and just clean fermenting. Let everything else that's in the beer show off, like the hops and the grain. Give that a good mix in since I made a starter here today. You don't necessarily have to make a starter, but if you have the ability to do so, it's always a good idea. Once that's all mixed in, go ahead and pour it into our fermenter. Very nice. I've also designed this recipe to have 2 dry hop additions. 1 ounce of Cascade and 1 ounce of Centennial is in each one of these canisters. One is going to be dropped 5 days till the end, and one is going to be dropped 3 days till the end. If you have the ability to do so, I recommend attaching it to your lid with magnets, just like I have. I have a video on how to do that if you'd like. Check it out here. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and gently flip this over, make sure that we don't lose the canisters, and attach it to our fermenter. Now normally I put this in my fermentation chamber so that way I can regulate the temperature. However, I have a couple beers in there already and I don't feel like pulling them out and putting this in there. So we're going to go ahead and ferment this at just room temperature. It's perfectly fine in here. Looks like we're at about 70 degrees. This yeast is okay at around, I think it's 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, so we're well within that range. we're gonna go ahead and put on our blow-off assembly. In my case, I have a Cold Crash Guardian. And then we'll see you at the tasting. Let's get to riding the Centennial Trail, or should I say drinking the Centennial Trail IPA. Let's take a look at this guy. A little bit cloudy. I imagine that will probably clear up as this ages a little bit and it lagers. However, I'm rushing to film this because this has been such a hit on tap, it's already halfway gone. So, let's get to talking about this. For starters, kind of a malty, definitely a rye smell to it in the background. If you've ever smelled rye or tasted rye, you kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about here. Not a whole lot of hop character coming through. Not as much as I would have expected necessarily from the amount that we dry hopped, which, looking at my notes, we did 1 ounce of Cascade and 1 ounce of Centennial 5 days before packaging, and then we did another ounce of Centennial and another ounce of Cascade 3 days before packaging. So there's a fair amount of hops in this, and it definitely comes through in the flavor. Smell, it's a little bit lacking. If you want that smell to come through, maybe pack in a few more in that dry hop, but otherwise, to be honest, I'm keeping this recipe the way it is. This hits my 5-star category. Not many of my beers hit the 5-star category, but again, my friends are already requesting this as gifts. It's that good. I mean, let's go ahead and taste this real quick. It just hits all the notes. Super nice and spicy from that rye and the Cascade and Centennial. And just, it's a perfectly balanced beer. Doesn't need anything more in my opinion. Oh, good. Before I end up drinking this all, let's go ahead and talk some notes about this beer. It started out at 1068 as an original gravity, and it came all the way down to 1008. So that leaves us with an alcohol percentage of 7.9%. So it's definitely not some slouch either. You have a couple of these, and well, from last weekend I can speak to the fact that these can hit you quick and they can hit you hard, so tread lightly. But other than that, it was a pretty uneventful fermentation. The few notes that I do have is, if you're somebody that doesn't have any sort of temperature control, you can still brew a great beer. This was not brewed in a temperature controlled environment. Now, that's not to say that if I were to do it again, I wouldn't put it in a temperature controlled environment. It is best to put a beer in a temperature controlled environment. But I did take note, this yeast is reported to be good up to 72 degrees. While it was fermenting, we got up to 75 degrees. Again, not ideal, but just proves to show that you can still make good beer even without all the extra tools that you necessarily need to make really great beer. Anyway, I think that's about all I have to say about this, because I'm going to just go drink it. If you end up brewing this or have any notes on it, just leave them down in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, cheers.